How long are we gonna stay out?
The people now have the power, and they're using it.
The United Campus Workers of Georgia are fighting for fair wages, fair raises, and for fair funding.
Strike Cobra, let's go.
Communication Workers of America. United Campus Workers of Georgia 3265, bitch. Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? Workers ship the boxes, they Swiffer and they mop and look chipper whenever talking and whipping the shopping carts. They pack the beer in the walk-ins and stack the weird little boxes. Keep our kitchen fridges stocked and our financial markets solvent. They clocking for a pithy $50 and bear the coffin of like 60 thrifty chuds and get spit on like sitting ducks. And they are sick of getting fucked. So you ever wanted to honor them? Here's my ask for all my hominids. Collective bargaining, Amazon and Target and FedEx and Walmart and Instacart and Whole Foods till we all get what we are to get. Workers run the company. There isn't any argument. So are you with them? Are you in? El Pueblo, unido, jamás será vencido. El Pueblo, unido, jamás será vencido. El Pueblo, unido, jamás será vencido. Jamás será vencido. Jamás será vencido. Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on? Imagine a minute, millions of average women and men in the tragic position of trading in passion for wages and cash 'cause they shackled by capitalism. Imagine a minute, millions of average citizens planting the spinach and waxing the kitchens and stacking the linens, contractors and renters and tenants, the labor extracted for pittance. What if they coordinated to address the sort of state of it in an organization? Cause fucking what? That's what organized labor does. And not even sort of, it's more of the crux. Taking the power from hoarders of bucks, big bankers offshore and they cuts, returning the value of labor to those who created the billionaires owe it to us. So if you're jaded and silly about waking up early, then earning bad. If you sad about Bernie, if you got a curious yearning and had it with passively lurking, we got your back and we happy to have you out on the picket line, actively working, going. Which side are you on? El Pueblo, unido, jamás será vencido. 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 Which side are you on?
All right. Hello, everyone. All right, can you hear me all right in here? Perfect. I'll check everything online. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our first class of There Is Power in a Union. Woo! Thank you so much for joining. This is a really, really amazing class, and I'm even more honored that Justine, that you're teaching this class. You're someone who I respect and love so much. You're a dear comrade, and you hold a wealth of knowledge, experience, and I'm really excited for you to be leading this class. For if you do not know, this is Justine Medina. She's a worker and community organizer based in New York City. She's active in the Amazon Labor Union at JFK 8 and serves on the executive committee of the Communist Party in the USA. In 2021, she and her organizers, she and her coworkers organized the first successful union election at Amazon, which is amazing, a huge feat, and really, I'm really excited to learn from you from this, and thank you for all that you do. I'm really honored to have you. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to you.
All right, amazing.
Just wait for the PowerPoint to and let Tahia get sitting again. Hi everyone. Like Saidi said, my name is Justine. I so just want to a few quick notes. I'm not a teacher by trade, so I am just going to be honest. I'm very nervous. I've never done like a class like this before. So thank you all for, I see it more as like a, we're all learning together kind of experience. You know, the People's Forum really believes in a popular education model of workers educating each other and themselves. So I'm honored to be invited to be a part of that. And then another disclaimer is just that there's a lot I am going to be leaving out of this course about revolutionary trade unionism because we have 8 hours together total. So there's only so much that can be covered in there. But if there's anything from your own experiences or understandings of history that you want to bring to the discussion, please do. Please do. So yeah, let's get started. So the first thing we started with, which maybe some of you were able to watch it, or maybe you're familiar with the video before, was this song "Work" by an artist known as Lingua Franca. She's based in Georgia. And I'm going to be starting and ending all of these classes with revolutionary music because I myself am an amateur musician, but more than just a sort of personal love for the music, music has always been a really important part of the revolutionary experience, the revolutionary movements, of the trade movements, and you know, both as a way to help celebrate and bring joy, and as a way to organize. So while we're thinking of while we're studying the history and we're thinking of the tools we can use, I think it's also good to look at the cultural aspect and think through that. The artist who made that song, Lingua Franca, she is a union organizer herself. She works with USSW, the Union of Southern Service Workers, which is a new union that formed out of the Raise Up the South a couple years ago. And she's also an active organizer in the Stop Cop City movement in Atlanta. Yes, no, absolutely. It's something, if you're not following, although probably all of you are, but if you're not following in the US, you should be paying attention to it. And I just want to draw attention to her because what we find in history of revolutionary movements is even when there's a revolutionary movement that you don't necessarily think of as a workers' struggle, there are always worker organizers and unionists involved in that struggle. You'll find it. It's true, right? So even though the narratives of history don't always point that out, it's always there. And I think that it's really important that we look at the struggles in that way. I know a number of you are also Marxists like myself, or Marxist-Leninists of some kind. Maybe not everyone is. But as a Marxist, I think it's very important to study revolutions from the perspective of the workers. And we know as Marxist revolutionaries that workers are sort of the foreground of revolutionary struggle. So we want to be thinking of every revolutionary movement in those terms. So excited with that, next slide. So thank you. So outline of today's lessons. So first, we're going to do a bit of a study of the manifesto. We're going to look at, you know, the Marxist understanding of why the working class is the most revolutionary class and why they are central to revolution. And then we're going to look at a couple of examples of this in action historically, the Black Reconstruction in the US and the Cuban Revolution. So next slide. Next slide. Defining the working class. So a quick note here. you know, as Marxist revolutionaries, we talk about the working class and the workers being the most revolutionary. I just want to point out that this isn't just a subjective notion. This doesn't come from a feeling. Marx and Engels are not really describing a moral position. They were students of history, and they're attempting to lay down an objective material reality. The set of social relationships that create the working class are a requirement for there to be a capitalist class. And the working class ultimately drawing the other classes to join the working class is inevitable as capitalists expand and consolidate. So monopoly power becoming centralized to smaller and smaller set of kings and capitalists. I think that's also important to think about, because sometimes you'll see in arguments, particularly online, on social media, people get really into an emotional state and start defending their analysis based on an idealist kind of understanding of workers. And I think it's really important, you know, it's like we study this history and we study workers because we're trying to push forward a movement. And so it's important for us to try to stay as objective as possible when we make our analyses in order to move forward revolutionary and labor struggle. So next slide. Okay, so this is the beginning of quotes. I'm going to ask for volunteers to read slides. And who wants to be the first to read some Marx? There's a comrade over there. We're just going to run you the mic. Thank you, Tahia.
The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles.
Keep going. Yeah.
Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinct feature. It has simplified class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, two great classes directly facing each other.
The bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Next slide. Thank you. The bourgeois and the proletariat are the terms, and again, I apologize if a lot of this is review for some of you. It's always good to review, but in case it's not, it's good to get a sense of these terms. So when Marxists talk about the bourgeois, what do they mean by that? They mean the capitalists, the people that own capital, the top bosses. They're the private owners of the means of production. Their social status is in production. And there's a quote from the manifesto that says, to be a capitalist is to have not only a purely personal, but a social status in production. Capital is a collective product, and only by the united action of many members, nay, in the last resort, only by the united action of all members of society can it be set in motion. So capitalists have capital, they legally own capital, but that capital only exists because of a social system of the workers in society that creates it. Capitalism is the system that is centered around the capitalist mode of production, centered around profit, and distinctive of capitalism is its continued necessity to spread, as well as progressing the technological advances at the production line. And they do this to increase profit, but then the workers can use, you find interesting contradictions, right, where the workers can then use this technological advance. Well, in some ways it can hurt the workers and get them out of jobs, but in other ways, workers can use these technological advances in their own ways to fight back against the bosses. So a continued push-pull. And then the proletariat, that's the working class and workers. Now, of course, not all members of the working class are necessarily working at all times, not necessarily currently employed by a boss. But the working class are the members of society that do not own the means of production. and they're forced to sell their labor power for a wage to survive. Workers and the proletariat, they run all society, they create the profit that is stolen by the bosses. They're most powerful in collectives, for example, unions. And because they're necessary for the creation of capital, they have the power to most affect the capitalist at the production line where that capital is created. And the proletariat is a global and international class. Next slide. Okay, so precarity is built into the life of the worker and the working class. It's the system of capitalism is designed to give you just enough to get by, to cover your reproductive labor costs. Can anyone in here give a short definition of reproductive labor? If not, that's okay, but I just want to, or anyone online want to give it a go, what reproductive labor is? There's two, someone can just pick and we'll get you the other one next time.
The labor required to do what's necessary for you to be able to get up the next day and do more labor.
Correct. So it's reproductive labor is exactly right. It's the sort of unpaid voluntary labor. You need to do more paid labor for the bosses. And unemployment, which in the Marxist term we call the unemployed the reserve army of labor, because unemployment is a forced condition. It is a policy choice. It need not exist. We all live in this world, and we know that there's enough work to go around to live as a collective society. But the bosses keep a certain segment of the population unemployed as a stick to poke at the employed workers and say, if you don't do what I say, you're going to become part of that. And also when they do fire people, they can pull in other people from the reserve army of labor. So unemployment and market crises are built into the system to destabilize the workers and also allow for mass consolidation by the capitalists when the market crises happen. I mean, we just saw this with the banks. Again, a few weeks ago in the US, they're coming in, being bailed out, and they're being consolidated under bigger banks, right? So it's also not just the unemployed who are part of the reserve army of labor. Marx talks about in Capital, volume 1, that's the Twitter image on the right there, this idea that capitalism not disables people in a very literal sense. So capitalism and doing work hurts the body and doesn't want workers to be able to take care of themselves. So they're made disabled over time. And capitalism also wants to keep disabled workers from being able to just participate in society. Again, in order to be part of that reserve army of labor, a stick. Next slide. So the different divisions of strata within the working class. The basic thing to remember is, even though there are contradictions within the working class, if you sell your labor for a wage, you are a worker. You're part of the working class, right? It doesn't matter if you're a tech worker and that wage is $200,000 a year. I mean, the contradictions in there often give those workers a false sense of class consciousness, or not really class consciousness, but a false sense of consciousness where they think of themselves as a capitalist or boss or a well-off person, but they're workers, right? And the capitalists try to use these divisions of the different strata, the false consciousnesses, to pit workers against each other. But as organizers, we want to remember that all workers are workers. Next slide. What about the petit bourgeois? So what about the people that are small business owners, that are small capitalists. They're not workers. How do we feel about them, right? That's a great question. Next slide. So this is a long slide for reading. We could divide it into two, I guess. Who wants to read? And if anyone online wants to read, let them start. But if not, just go. You can read again. Does anyone? Although, did you raise your hand before? Did you want to read?
The first one or first two paragraphs?
Yeah, first two paragraphs.
Okay. The lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, and retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on and is swamped in the competition with large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by new methods of production. Thus, the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular, a portion of the bourgeois ideologists who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole.
Does someone want to read the second half?
I can also just take it.
Oh, yeah.
The lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary, but conservative. Nay more, they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are only so in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat. They thus defend not their present, but their future interests. They desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat. All previous historical movements were movements of minorities or in the interest of minorities. The proletarian movement is a self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, in the interest of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lower stratum of our peasant society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up without the whole super incumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air.
Thank you. So when Marx talked about the middle classes, he meant what we today refer to as the petit bourgeois, small business owners, self-sufficient, individuals, peasant classes. And the basic idea is, even though these individuals are, often antagonistic to the workers, in the long run, they can't compete with the top capitalists and the top bosses. They get bought up into consolidation. The small business owner and Jeff Bezos, right? They have nothing in common, basically. They have basically nothing in common. And what we see, as Marx described, is during periods of revolution, and you see this, not only in the 1800s and the sort of revolutions of Europe that he's talking about, but also going forward in the 20th century, all the revolutions of the 20th century, you do see this. You see an alliance between the proletariat, the workers, and the peasants, or the middle classes. Whether you're in the Russian Revolution, Vietnam, Cuba, even during, of course, the example we cite from the US of the Black Reconstruction, you see all these sort of contradictory classes coming together, but ultimately being guided by the working class. Now, one thing that I think is important to point out is that when the petit bourgeois splits, they can go two ways, right? So they can either align themselves with the workers, or they become the most reactionary, and you see them become fascistic, far right. So that is, there's no guarantees there, of course, but there is sort of that old canard of socialism versus barbarism. You see that within the petit bourgeois split as well. And we want to try to get them to our side. Yes. Oh, wait, sorry. You need the mic to be heard online. Well, yeah, we don't really have, I mean, in a modern American sense, we don't really have peasants, but that sort of referred to like a sort of farmer owner, like a family run farm type situation of the time, but we don't really have, and also, or the countries, it's sort of the countryside, right? So although I say we don't, and probably people from rural areas could give a something. Yeah, yeah. But peasant classes were huge, in Russia, all over Southeast Asia. It's a class that often develops in the farming sense. But of course, in the US, because slavery was so central to the foundation of our country, we never really developed a similar kind of peasant. There was always this sort of owning class ruling the countryside. So great question. Yeah. Saidi, whenever you're ready, next slide. Yeah. So that's the point, right? We are the 99%, that slogan that came out of Occupy, right? Even the small business owners, even, God forbid, I say this, the small landlords, right? Like you see, you can find ways to bring people together. And that's when there have been successful revolutionary struggles. This has been the case. It's never just been the working class. The working class leads, but it's never just been the working class. They find ways to bring everyone together. Next slide. So why is the revolutionary class most revolutionary class? The existence, our existence, is essential to the very functioning of capitalism. Without workers, there is no capitalism. Straight up. The working class are the ones that have the power to really shut down society. Again, it's about production. You find that when you shut down production, that's where you really hurt the capitalists. And when you're trying to organize social revolution without including the workers, it's like you can only make slight, small attacks. All other non-capitalist classes ultimately end up joining the working class as consolidation happens. And the workers are the ones that have the power to wage socialist revolution, which is what I'm trying to do. And I think many of you are too. So next slide. Infrastructures of solidarity. Okay, continue. Thank you. So who wants to read this slide? Comrade over here.
Thanks. The workers begin to form combinations, trades, unions against the bourgeois. They club together in order to keep up the rate of wages. They found permanent associations in order to make provision beforehand for these occasional revolts. Here and there, the contest breaks out into riots. Now and then, the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battle lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. This union is helped on by the improved means of communication that are created by modern industry. In that place, the workers of different localities in contact with one another. It was just this contact that was needed to centralize the numerous local struggles. All of the same character into one national struggle between classes. But every class struggle is a political struggle, and that union to attain which the burghers, is that, how do you say that?
I think so.
We think so. Cool. Yeah, the burghers of the Middle Ages, with their miserable highways, required centuries. The modern proletarian, thanks to railways, achieve in a few years.
Yeah, I always love rereading the manifesto because it's really interesting to see how, again, even though Marx was describing a historical process, it's mostly he's looking back at the history of Europe. You still find like all of this relevant stuff. So eventually, when workers are under the yoke of capitalism, they come together and they say, we're not going to take this shit anymore. And they form unions. And those unions result in victories. But then again, there's this push-pull and an ebb and flow, right? Until you succeed in your revolution, in establishing the beginnings of a revolution. That's always going to be the case, and even afterwards somewhat. The most important thing is that you keep trying to build the unions. You keep trying to build those infrastructures of solidarity. You keep trying to build the collective and keep the collective going, even when there is a setback, because progress, even though it is always happening, is not linear, as the saying goes. It does this sort of ebb and flow and backwards and forwards, and so it can feel like when you're in a period of setback, especially a period of stasis, that you're not moving forward. But as long as you're continuing to fight, continuing to expand the union, you are. So next slide. So the working class, right, in order to be successful, needs to develop collectives. We're going to be talking about unions in this class, but there's other, there's tenant organizations, there's women's associations, and there's all kinds of creative communities you can find online. So, just be creative with it. The point is, we can't do anything alone, and we need to come together to do really anything. So next, cool. So contemporary technological progress and problems. Marx talks a lot about technology because technological advances and the contradictions of that advancement is an important part of capitalism. It's actually the sort of quote unquote good part of capitalism, right? Is that it forces, the bosses are looking for technological advances, and that is good. It's like the idea of automation, right, is a good thing, especially under a socialist society, right? People would have to work less. That's a good thing, right? But in a capitalist society, that automation is weaponized against the workers, and it just leads to layoffs. And so people oppose the automation, right? But two areas that I think are really important to explore with modern technology, I was thinking about the gig economy, which is, how a lot of people work these days and is facilitated through apps mostly, and social media, both, so this infrastructures of social media, a lot of us spend a lot of time in this liminal space. It's a distraction. It's also a helpful thing. So just look at time. Yeah, we're good on time. So next slide. Who wants to read this slide? Anyone online?
All right, feel free to unmute yourself online if you'd like to read. Just go ahead and do it.
Hello. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. The growing competition among the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crisis make the wages of the workers even more fluctuating.
The
increasing
bourgeoisie
improve.
cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. The growing competition amongst the bourgeois and the resulting commercial crises make the wages of the workers ever more fluctuating. The increasing improvement of machinery, ever more rapidly developing, makes their livelihood more and more precarious. The collisions between individual workmen and individual bourgeois take more and more of the character of collisions between two classes. This organization of the proletarians into a class and consequently into a political party is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. But it ever rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier. It compels recognition of particular interests of the workers by taking advantage of the divisions among the bourgeoisie itself.
Thank you so much. So, right. So again, because a lot of this class is going to be looking at history, I do want to take moments of thinking about today and jumping back and forth between those. So technological development today has facilitated the rise of the gig economy. This alienates workers from each other. Very different conditions than a warehouse or a factory floor or even a small shop where you're all together. It's, you know, it's not easily socialized labor. So I just want to throw out there, if people, you know, it's like, how do we overcome this, right? We have not yet seen a successful gig union. And if there's anyone in here or watching who's part of that labor struggle, like, thank you. I don't mean to denigrate your work. I just mean that gigification of everything is a route that the capitalists are taking for a reason. And you know, it's because it does make it really hard for gig workers to connect and then ultimately, like, overcome the sort of bosses. So this is something I think about a lot, like, what do we do? So I just want to open up the floor to allow for discussion. If people have also been thinking about this, if, you know, it's like, yeah, what do we do? This is what I mean by, like, we're all studying together, because I have no answer for that question and we need to figure it out, right? So I don't know if people have thoughts. If not, we can just, like, move on to the next. Oh, comrade over here has some thoughts.
I mean, I don't know exactly, but I'm just thinking about, like, for instance, at my job, I feel like a lot of the times I don't even have time to, even though I work in an office with other people, like, I can't even talk to my fellow workers because we're all doing things. And I feel like that is, so then we talk, like, on a lunch break, or talk, like, you know, going on a walk or something like that, or, you know, just talk anyways, even though we're supposed to be working. And I feel like you could do the same, like, maybe there could be, like, a social media element where, even though, you know, I feel like gig workers are often working alone and individually, like, maybe social media could be a tool that is used to connect people, or have some sort of space where you can, you know, talk about whatever problems you're going through that day or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about, like, the delivery food workers and people who are maybe have similarities, like, not just in their gig jobs, but also, like, community similarities or, like, cultural background similarities, where, like, you see people using social media or, like, WhatsApp to connect. I don't know. So maybe, like, some sort of overlap with, like, community organizing as a way to get past the isolation of the gig economy could be one way to look at it. I don't know.
Thank you. Any more? Oh, the comrade in the back.
I was kind of thinking about, like, this might sound awful, but, like, through healthcare, because, like, all forms of work, and, like, that tweet pointed out, gig economy is, like, hugely disabling. One of the things that brings people to gig work
is because they can't do other forms of work due to work being so disabling. And like thinking about at some point in time, most people have to interact with healthcare in some sort of way. And for better or for worse, like that's its own like bag of gross sometimes. But it's a really powerful moment because the way people interact with healthcare also comes from like culture and age and race and all of these different things. So like as the people up front pointed out, like it's about connecting those other parts of themselves, their identities. And like healthcare is like an intersection of that, and like in a way that like maybe you can't find just by thinking about how they work, you know.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I also have something. And I also don't have an answer. Think about this a lot, but any like organizing a scene of workers gig economy wise has been through 501c3. So like Street Vendor Project, Los Deliveristas Unidos, or through Drum, like organizing like street vendors, delivery workers, etc. And I don't know if like the answer is actually like a mass org or political party that's organizing the gig workers through that way. So that's an additional question. And another question I'm thinking about is the work from home culture and how even more alienating of that working class that's of the upper income making is. So like passing that as well. I don't know.
All right. Leslie online says, we can think of ways to organize gig work as worker cooperatives. Platform cooperatives are becoming more present. I worked for the drivers cooperative, which aims to be the alternative to Uber. And then we have two questions from Anwesh. So the first is, what about managers, people who control the means of production as a wage job without owning those means? Do we consider them part of the proletariat or the petite bourgeoisie, since they serve and actively advance the interests of the bourgeoisie without being a member of the bourgeoisie? And his second question is, today, many well-off wage workers are shareholders of companies or invest in capital, albeit very insignificantly considered individually. How can they be classified into the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, either in material terms or in ideological terms?
Sorry, Sadie, could you repeat the second question?
Yeah. Today, many well-off wage workers are shareholders of companies or invest in capital, albeit very insignificantly considered individually. How can they be classified into the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, either in material terms or in ideological terms?
Okay. I'm thinking about the second one more because I don't know if I have an answer to it. But but yeah, what about managers? So if managers work for a wage, then they are working class. But a lot of times managers are, of course, you know, sort of enforcers of the boss. They're really played on a false consciousness to divide. But you do find, you know, sympathetic managers. They get fired a lot of times during union campaigns. Actually, like you'll find a cleanup after a successful or even unsuccessful union campaign of sympathetic, even just slightly managers are fired, right? You know, or sometimes they really keep their sympathies under wraps, but they, you know, during the ALU drive, part of our success was help along from managers who sort of helped pass us lists of how many people were working there and who was working there, because obviously Amazon wouldn't give us those lists. So, you know, it's like the managers, you don't want to trust them because they can, you know, they can be the cops of the workplace, but you do want to be open to the possibility that they could help you, right? So it's a bit of a dialectical thing, but yeah, they are workers. If they, you know, they're not even petit bourgeois because they don't control any of their capital or means of production at all. They're employed. And then the second question of, you know, wage workers being investors, or probably a more complicated thing of like, you know, anyone that has like a 401k, like those investments go into, you know, it's like, I don't actually know the technical Marxist answer to that. You know, I mean, I think it still is a classification of workers. I think there's just probably false consciousness there when you know, but yeah, I would have to ask some economist friends for the technical Marxist answer. I'm also curious. I've wondered that myself, so I don't know the answer, but it's a good question. Thank you. So then the next sort of pondering that I do a lot related to tech questions is social media. You know, it's like, as people have brought up, social media can be a great way for workers to come together. But then we've also all seen the way that social media creates antagonisms and division, especially social media in capitalist society. You know, this is a profit-making tool, right? They don't charge us to be on Twitter. I mean, Elon's trying, right? But like for now, you know, we're not charged to be on there. So the way that they make money is to sell our data, et cetera, et cetera. We all know this. They have to keep us online to do that. So it's like the antagonisms are fostered by the model under capitalist social media on purpose. They want people fighting. This is built into, like, they did all kinds of really creepy psychological studies to really maximize, like, how much can we make people fight with each other online. You know, so how, you know, I just want to, you know, and then also we've seen social media can keep people, you know, it's again a great tool to bring people together, you know, especially disabled workers who are stuck at home, but then it can also be a way to keep able people stuck at home so that they're not, you know, out on the streets doing something else they can do. So I just would love to hear, you know, if folks in here have been also thinking through similar things, like, what are your thoughts on social media? How can we use it as a tool in labor organizing, but also, like, how do we work to overcome it? I have a little bit more of an answer to this one, if, you know, so we'll see if you get that, but if not, you know, and if not, I can just say some things, but.
Thank you. The way I think about this is kind of not so much social media, but rather the ways we connect with people online. I think so. I'm organizer as part of a campaign that used to be in a workplace that was entirely work from home, and now we're entirely work from the office. So I got to experience both ends of that, and I'll say that my job as an organizer is about as hard all the time. It's just different challenges. Like when we were work from home, it was very easy to connect with people during times where they would not be monitored by the boss, right? I could ask for someone's number and then I send them a text on Signal, and then I'm able to have a call with them in a way that's not monitored. Now, building solidarity in that context was very, very difficult because it was with people that I'd never met before. Now that we're all back in the office, I get to connect with my team members and we get to build solidarity in like very tangible ways. But on the other hand, it's much more complicated to meet people that I've never met before, to create those connections that are very necessary to expand the movement. So I feel like in every situation, you're always going to have like those strengths and weaknesses, and it's really your job as an organizer to kind of like work with them. So yeah, just always has as hard, and you just need to find the strength.
I have like questions around social media and with surveillance, and like, how do you actually do clandestine organization when through social media it's like, you know, my questions are on like, we have this new like influx of New York Times and Bandcamp and like these media orgs, and that form of working class organization unionizing happening, and that's a big social media push because these are working class folks who are able to utilize the tool of social media in a way that's useful for them. But then how about those who would get fired from the warehouse, or I don't know, questions around that.
Anyone online?
Anwar just shared a movie on gig economy workers. It's called Sorry We Missed You. It might be an interesting watch.
Oh, yes. Thank you. I love recommendations. Sorry we missed you. That's great. Thank you. Yeah, these are just questions we're all thinking about all the time. And yeah, clandestine, right. We live in a surveillance state. So we also do actually want to think about that. It's like, even though we're using we can use social media as a tool, we want to remember as organizers, like, if there's things you don't want to be talking, especially as we're seeing with TikTok wars, right? Like, you're seeing a sort of crackdown on social media in a sort of potentially criminal way. Like, we do want to keep that in mind, because we've all gotten really used to freewheeling and saying everything we think online, and maybe that's not always going to be the way we can do things. So yeah, the other thing I'd say, Tahia sort of hinted at it, but right, who runs the social media? Who runs the internet? The workers, right? So and we've been seeing over the last year, as with all these tech sector layoffs, tech workers really starting to get radicalized and really realize, get rid of that false consciousness and see themselves as workers, right? Which is really exciting. So yeah, I think we got to try to unionize Twitter, and that's how we can overcome Elon, right? Because if the workers gain enough power in these social media sectors, then they can help make it less antagonistic environment. They can design social media that is more collaborative, right? And yeah, okay, thank you all for engaging in these discussions. We're going to move on to the next slide. The Communist Party and the working class. Okay, so this class is about revolutionary trade unionism. Like I said, I am leaving a lot out, but I decided to narrow the focus down to looking at explicitly the sort of communist history, and there will be some touching, of course, on anarcho-syndicalists, and the next class is going to be a history class, so there will be some touch on that, but we're really looking at the communist movement, and so yeah, so that's what I'm going to be talking about. I just want to make that clear. If you're not in the Communist Party, and you're in another group or party, or you're not even a communist, that's totally cool. We should all work together. But I just wanted to throw that out there. That's my bias, where it's coming from. So next slide. Okay, so who wants to read the top quote? Come right in the back over there.
In what relation? Oh, is it on? Yeah. Okay. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only. 1. In the national struggles of the proletarians of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interests of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. 2. In the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeoisie has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interests of the movement as a whole. The manifesto.
Thank you. So that's from if you haven't read the manifesto before this class, that's from a chapter I did not assign, but read the whole thing. It's great. So Karl Marx was a member of the first Communist Party, right? He helped found it, right? The International Working Men's Association, it was called IWA. And they were trying to define how communists want to relate to sections of the working class, especially compared to the different, there was a very popular anarchist movement in Europe at the time. and there were movements that were fairly sectarian. But the thing that distinguishes communists is they're really trying to avoid that sectarianism. Communist Party has not always been, like done, sometimes falters at being, non-sectarian, but the goal is to unite all the classes and unite all of the working class, especially. There's a quote by Lenin, I'm going to paraphrase, that it talks about how the communists know that they have to work with all of the classes. They will only be a small segment of the revolution. The revolution cannot happen without all of the people. The communist theory of a vanguard party necessarily, the vanguard party meaning the most advanced, by which they mean the workers who understand dialectical materialism, historical materialism, and sort of understand how to move these things forward. The most advanced segments of the working class help lead and guide everyone else. But the idea is that's only going to be a small percentage, maybe 5%, 5% of, for example, in China, it's 5% of the population is in the party, right? So obviously you have to be able to play nice and work well with everyone. So that's mainly what the communists are always trying to do, is the Communist Party mindset is, how do we bring all these sections together among all their contradictions? How do we do it? And the reason the Communist Party is trying to do that is, this quote from Lenin, which you'll read parts of what is to be done next week. But the spontaneous element, in essence, represents nothing more nor less than consciousness in an embryonic form. It marked the awakening antagonisms between workers and employers, but the workers were not and could not be conscious of their irreconcilable antagonism of their interests to the whole of the modern political and social system, right? So revolution isn't spontaneous. It does not just happen. Consciousness does not just arise. It has to be brought to bear. Even if a trade union consciousness, a consciousness about your economic conditions being bad, does arise naturally, just historically speaking, this sort of complex understanding of society will not arise without intervention, right? We can all think of people who intervened and helped teach us these things, and it's our duty to do the same. So the communists are both trying to bring together all of these separate divisions of society, including the very much non-communist and even anti-communist sections, right? And sometimes do that in ways that aren't you're not necessarily always saying all of the buzzwords, right? But then also you have to find ways to be saying all the buzzwords and be teaching people these things, so that the revolutionary mindset can continue. Next slide. Okay, so the Communist Party strives to, like I said, work across divisions and advance the democratic struggles. That's the CP term for it, the Communist Party term for the other kinds of non-economic struggles. They're all democratic, small d democratic struggles. And we seek to connect these areas, which are often organized separately, culturally, and bring them together because they all interconnect. They're not distinct at all. So I'm sure everyone in here already understands this, but sometimes you will encounter people who consider themselves communist and are socially reactionary. And you've also seen this in history from really great leaders, but they're socially reactionary in various ways, unfortunately, right? So I just want to make it plain. Combating racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, all manifestations of oppression are issues of class struggle, right? And they've always been central to the Communist Party, including in Marx's day, right? You know, I mean, Marx and Engels wrote a lot about colonialism and slavery and these kinds of injustices, and said that they were central to overturning capitalism, like ending these injustices and the people under the yoke leading the end of those injustices is central to defeating capitalism. So this has always been the case, even though, again, you've not always seen communist parties live up to this all the time, or communists live up to this all the time, but that is the duty of communists. So next slide. These are some more quotes from the manifesto in a section you didn't read, and just sort of getting at this, this sort of socially progressive nature of the Communist Party. So who wants to read the first one up top in red, the red box?
You communists would introduce a community of women, screams the bourgeoisie in chorus. The bourgeois sees his wife as a mere instrument of production. He hears that the instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and naturally can come to no other conclusion than that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to the women.
Thank you. So I have some, next to the red box, I have some pictures of protests in response to the Dobbs decision that happened last year in the US, overturning Roe v. Wade, rolling back, the small abortion protections we had. A very powerful image of some women crying, consoling each other on the day the decision came down. And then also, many of you probably participated in these, but a picture from the protests that happened last summer in response to it. And we're really starting to see this reactionary pushback, right? And then I'll read the next one because it's so small. Abolition of the family, even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. So there's a little happier pictures next to it, not the US, unfortunately, but many of you may know last year, Cuba, Cuban citizens voted on a new families code. Their families code had not been updated since the 60s. And it was a huge election, like 8 million people came out to vote, and 67% voted in favor of the most progressive family code in the world. So Cuba already had, they have free healthcare, of course, and as part of that healthcare, they'd already been giving free transgender medical needs to people since the 80s. There was a little bit of time in the 90s where there was reactionary pushback at that because the special period, and you find when there's economic unrest everywhere, reactionary feelings rise. But then that was, pushed back again, and in the 2000s made part of the law that, it's like, no, it's like, we're going to give transgender healthcare to transgender people. That was already the case, but officially sanctioned same-sex marriage not been allowed, officially sanctioned adoption, officially sanctioned fertility treatment for lesbian couples, like all of this stuff, a lot of it was happening in an unofficial capacity. So Cubans were just voting on like things that they already agreed with, but they became, solidified into law. And it was more than just gay marriage, right? There's protections for children, protections for elders. And in my opinion, Cuba basically abolished the capitalist family. You know, I mean, you could disagree with me, but that's how I've been like celebrating in my head since, you know, November. It's very exciting. And yeah, they're leading the way, which is great. So back to some distressing things in the US. Who wants to read the green box? That's true. Yeah.
And your education is not that also social and determined by the social conditions under which you educate, by the intervention, direct or indirect, of society by means of schools, etc. The communists have not invented the intervention of society in education. They do but seek to alter the character of that intervention and to rescue education from the influence of the ruling class. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education and the hollowed correlation of parents and child becomes all the more disgusting the more, by the action of modern industry, all the family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder and their families or their children transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this has sort of always been the case. The conservative and reactionary bourgeois elements of society have always claimed to be fighting for quote unquote the family. But that notion of the quote unquote family they're fighting for is incredibly harmful. And, you know, we see that, you know, you saw it in Marx's time based on the things they fought for, that it was absurd for them to say that they care about family and children. And you see it today, right? You know, I'm sure many of you are terrified as I am by the, you know, attacks on public education that are happening, you know, particularly in Florida and Texas, but it's hardly the only place. It's really those are models, right, that are being exported across the country. But you see attacks on teaching the history of Black liberation, on teaching the history of LGBTQ, or even talking about being, you know, a number of teachers have been fired in the last year for just mentioning being, you know, having a same-sex partner, right? And that's really terrifying. And you're also starting to see, you know, capitalists respond to the latest crisis that they are facing by bringing back child labor, right? Passing, you know, they were passing laws to allow for companies to hire kids as young as 9, 10. And then you're also finding, you know, I don't know if anyone else saw that expose a few weeks ago, but there's been a lot of big companies finding using migrant child labor on purpose. I know, you know, like 8, 9 years old in the factories. I mean, we're really seeing a rollback to why we even formed unions in the first place. And yeah, that's sort of what we're fighting against. So, but I just wanted to make it clear that in case you ever run into people who talk about themselves being communists and they have a sort of reactionary ideology, like, no, straight up, like from the beginning, like Marx was like, no, we're like socially progressive and we care about, you know, I could go on and talk about all this fun stuff, but let's move. We're a little low on time, so we're good on time. We're perfect. Okay. Now, Manifesto has helped guide us to thinking about why the working class is the most revolutionary class and how they come together in collectives. But now we want to look at actual examples of workers building revolution. So next slide. The unfinished revolution, Black Reconstruction. Next slide. So for those of us who think of ourselves as revolutionaries in the United States, especially those of us who have taken up the task of building revolution in this country, we must study the period of Black Reconstruction as a revolutionary one, as a workers' revolution in particular. This history is very much alive today. We can feel it all around us. And finishing the Reconstruction, this is my, I wrote this, so this is like my opinion and other people's opinions, not only my, but there's a growing consensus around this opinion and long consensus around it. But finishing the Reconstruction is the path forward to socialist revolution in this country. Slavery, enslaved workers built this country. It's been central to the economic reality of it from the beginning. This is why Marx wrote about, slavery needing to be abolished, the sort of famous line of, white worker can never be free while the black worker is, in chains, right? It is the central contradiction of the United States. And the closest that we've ever come to negating that contradiction into a socialist revolutionary context is the Civil War, and which was, the biggest workers' strike in U.S. history, probably. Like the slave workers led a revolt. They were like, "No, we're not doing this." Leading up to then as well, there were also smaller revolts. Always, strikes. There was sabotage by enslaved workers of their the places they were working. Militant worker sabotage. It's funny because you can read accounts of like old white slave owners talking about like, oh, the slaves are so dumb, they like burned down the barn. And it's like, no, there was like literally like, no, they burned down the barn on purpose because they, they're not going to do the job. It's important to think about it in those terms and give real agency to the workers that were leading the struggle. And it's also important to just realize that the Black Reconstruction period, there were so many social advances that had never happened before, and that was led by the emancipated Black workers themselves. They were forcibly taking and redistributing land. The revolutionary period of the Reconstruction was held into place by force, but it was enforced by the troops, right? A lot of them Black regiments, but it was enforced by like the national military, right? Because revolution has to be defended with force because there are people on the outside trying to destroy it. And then the moment that those troops were fully pulled out, 10 years later, counter-revolution ensued, right? And you saw just sort of some of the beginnings of the worst terror on Black people that you'd ever seen. It's important that we study this history, that we live in this history, that we think about how this history lives around us, and that we apply it. There's been, I'm very excited to say, there's been renewed interest in this period over the last few years, sort of all across the left, social democrats to communists, everyone in between. Bernie even did a panel a few years ago on like sort of the Black Reconstruction period and labor. So that's really exciting to me. As I said, the communist movement has sort of always recognized this from Marx, and then the Communist Party, W.B. Du Bois ended up joining in part because of this recognition. His famous Black Reconstruction, if you've never read it, is a must read. But then also Eric Foner, who was the CPUSA historian for basically like the biggest one of the 20th century. He wrote, he titled it that, right? Like the Unfinished Reconstruction. He had a book called The Unfinished Revolution. Sorry. I think it's important that we all take this and yeah, just that's what we need to do. We need to beat the fascists this time and not let them regain power, and yeah, do whatever we can. Okay, so next slide. So this is also long. It can be split into two. If anyone wants to give a go the first one. Anyone online? No. Okay. You can read to here. Go ahead. Yeah. I mean, unless you're bringing it to someone.
Now the South was faced with a labor strike of slaves. The rebellion against the Confederacy had begun on the slave plantations, and the slaves were not passing up their chance for insurrection. They were not waiting on a decree or declaration of government to announce their freedom. Every time the Union Army moved, the fugitive slaves moved with it, for they flatly refused to act like the war was a dress parade. And when the war finally became a real war, slaves were either received or captured and used as much needed workers and servants. Of course, what we are describing is the beginning of the turning point in the Civil War, initiated by the arrival of these hordes of former slaves, who were more often than not followed by landless, homeless, white peasant families. Yet of greatest historical importance is the fact that out of this growing mass of striking slave workers and insurgents came 186,000 Black Union troops who took to the battlefields to confront their former oppressors and suffered 35% more casualties than any other group. Does anybody else want to read? Pass it back.
When the war ended, the working class wanted more of the benefits of its labor at a time when unemployment was rising along with large-scale immigration and post-war depression. These conditions gave rise to workers' demands for an 8-hour day with no decrease in pay and a more equal participation in the privileges and blessings of those free institutions defended by their manhood on many a bloody field of battle. Fully aware of the oncoming crisis to be faced by the U.S. working class in the wake of the Civil War, Karl Marx, writing on behalf of the General Council of the International Working Men's Association and congratulating the workers for the end of slavery, advised regarding future actions. An injustice to a section of your people has produced such direful results. Let that cease. Let your citizens of today be declared free and equal without reserve. If you fail to give them citizens' rights while you demand citizens' duties, there will yet remain a struggle for the future, which may again stain your country with your people's blood. The eyes of Europe and of the world are fixed on your efforts at reconstruction, and enemies are ever ready to sound the knell of the downfall of Republican institutions when the slightest chance is given. We warn you then, as brothers in common cause, to remove every shackle from freedom's limb, and your victory will be complete. Of course, these warnings were not heeded.
So funny. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, no, the warnings were not heeded. So for those of you that were able to do the reading or know this history, of course, you'll know that most white workers were still reactionary in this time period. There was a lot of still racism within the unions, a lot of white-only unions, a lot of white workers that didn't work to defend and advance Black liberation. The exception being mostly the communists. Communists had come over from Europe after the a lot of communists came over from Germany, especially after the was it 1948, 49 revolutions, and then more were sort of sent over in the late 50s, early 60s to help with the Civil War. So there was a sort of war moving to sort of advance this revolutionary struggle. And then you also had communists agitating in their unions and for Black-white unity and also forming their own unions. And but that was a minority, right? And the working class, unfortunately, capitalists took advantage of the horrific racism and pitted workers against each other. And that is also part of why the revolution didn't succeed, because, you know, even though Black workers were the majority in most of the South, along the Black Belt, as it was called, for a long time, you know, Black people just aren't the majority in this country, right? So you need a majority to continue revolution and succeed. So the divisions got in the way at the time, unfortunately. So real quick question before the next slide. Who can tell me when the Paris Commune happened? Anyone? Correct, 1871. 1871 was the year of the Paris Commune. So next slide. From the Paris Commune to the South Carolina Commune. So the Paris Commune was a pretty big deal at the time. Everyone was following along with it. This included the recently self-emancipated Black workers, right? There was remarks, you know, by reactionaries in the paper, you know, warning that, you know, if the poor white people and Black people get together, then they might do a commune here, and that would be really bad. So, but Black workers, you know, they proudly stood with the revolutionary movement. Many cited the Paris Commune as inspiration. Black workers joined the International Workingmen's Association. They protested in support of the Paris Commune. They stormed buildings, you know, all over the North, took them over. There was a regiment of Black soldiers in the Reconstruction South who staged a protest in response to the execution of the communards. So it, you know, people don't often think about these things happening at the same time and interplaying, but they really were, you know, just like today, just like there's an international movement today, and we pay attention, you know, to the renewed intifada, you know, in Palestine, right? And that affects us. And there's solidarity between Palestinian rights and Black Lives Matter, right? You see a sort of a similar solidarity has always been there. And that is also important to remember. And Black people in the South definitely, yeah, saw themselves as part of the revolutionary struggle. So the South Carolina Commune, that was a term by W.B. Du Bois. He also called, he occasionally would refer to South Carolina, the Reconstructive period South Carolina, as the dictatorship of the proletariat in the South, right? So, you know, and Reconstruction South Carolina was probably among the most radical in terms of what they were able to achieve legally in that 10 years time. You know, they did public education and healthcare for free, public institutions for people and families struggling with deafness or mental illness. They redistributed land to tens of thousands of people. They banned racial discrimination. But it was, you know, these kinds of revolutionary changes were happening all over the South. You know, there's a really fun example that Howard Zinn found from a Kentucky classroom, where I'm just going to quote, teacher, now children, you don't think white people are any better than you because they have straight hair and white faces. Students, no, sir. Teacher, no, they are no better, but they are different. They possess great power. They form this great government. They control this vast country. Now, what makes them different from you? Students, money. Teacher, yes, but what enabled them to obtain it? How did they get that money? Students, got it off us, stole it from us. So this is Zinn found a sort of written recording of a lesson that had happened in Kentucky. And, you know, Black teachers were teaching that the students, the idea of, you know, stolen labor. They weren't necessarily always using the Marxist terminology, but this kind of radical thinking and revolutionary thinking was what was propelling changes all over the South. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, it's 8. Okay, let's move on, and then we'll have time for discussion at the end. Okay, now we're going to jump forward almost 100 years and move locations a little bit further south to Cuba, and look at the Cuban revolutionary example. I'm sure everyone in this room is, familiar with the Cuban revolutionary example. Next slide. So when you think of the Cuban Revolution, a lot of times what is thought of is the sort of guerrilla face. You think of Fidel, you think of Che. Maybe if you're active in women's liberation, you think of Celia Sanchez, you think of, Vilma Espin, right? You think of the guerrilla fighters and leaders. You think of the takes rolling into Havana. You think of, all of this fight, right? You think of the crash of Granma. But, this is very interesting because there were only, ultimately by the end, after mass recruitment, there were only like 3,000 guerrilla fighters total. And revolution is never won by just a small group of people, right? It takes mass society. And this was the case in Cuba. There was a huge workers' revolution underpinning what was going on. And the unfortunate thing is that in the popular imagination, even in Cuba, right? Like the sort of popular imagination is to remember the guerrilla leaders and the guerrilla fighters and not really think about the mass workers' movements. And some of this, can be attributed to the fact that CTC, the workers union, the centralized workers union of Cuba, it's still called that today, that they won it back. The top leadership of that was reactionary, right? And did the bidding of the Batista dictatorship. So people are like, oh, the trade unions were just, they were just the worst. They were just awful. But mostly the workers within the unions were not. And also there was a vast workers underground movement that led the revolution. On January 1st, 1959, the day the revolution was, officially sort of won, the beginning of the revolutionary government, when Batista was, fled, right? There was a mass general strike all across the island. No one talks about that. But that was the revolution, right? Millions of workers being like, no, we're not going to work. We're going to celebrate the revolution winning, that was the revolution. And then even when that general strike is talked about, you usually don't look at how did you get there? Because we all know, all of us would love a general strike in this country, but you can't just snap your fingers and make a general strike happen. It's built over time that, workers coming together. Yeah, next slide. This is long and small. I apologize because I was, but yeah, does someone want to read the first half? Oh, can they hear me? They can hear you. Yeah. You just can't hear that. Oh no. Okay. Okay.
Okay. In the period from the end of 1956 to the beginning of May 1958, 2 important mass strikes took place in Cuba. The first, starting in Santiago de Cuba at the beginning of August 1957, was a great success. The second, called for April 9th, 1958, was an abject failure. An analysis of these events is crucial in gaining an understanding of the development tactics of the communists and the July 26th movement. The lessons learned by the rebels from the failure of the April strike resulted in far-reaching organizational and political changes, arguably ensuring the final victory of the revolutionary forces. As 1957 progressed, the predominant political and social question became the continued existence of the dictatorship. This change in priorities by the communists from the economic to the political combined with the growing realization that small-scale industrial action was becoming impractical in the face of repression, resulted in increased workplace sabotage and clandestine aid to the rebels, while the frequency of local or sector-based strikes decreased through 1957 and early 1958. As part of this progress, the July 26th movement set up a committee to organize the spread of clandestine revolutionary working class organizations from Guantanamo and Santiago to the rest of the island, and at the same time building a support network for the rebels in the hills. We can see results of this clandestine organization in the successful general strike in Oriente province, which was sparked by the death of Frank Pais, a popular national leader of the July 26th urban underground, who was murdered by the police in Santiago in August 1957. This strike is commonly characterized as spontaneous, but a more nuanced explanation is needed that considers the relationship between spontaneity and organization.
Does anyone else want to read the second half? If not, the comment can continue. But
okay. Following the strike, both the communists and the July 26th movement stepped up their propaganda for a general strike to overthrow the regime. However, the leaders of these organizations drew very different conclusions from the strike, each using the experience to reinforce an entrenched position. Nevertheless, starting in October 1957, the communist and rebel army leaderships began talking to each other on a relatively formal basis. However, discussions with the communists had not greatly advanced by the time of the July 26th movement. By the time the July 26th movement called a general strike on April 9th, 1958. This strike, which received almost no working class support in Havana, cost the lives of many of the movement's best underground activists. The subsequent repression was particularly severe, with Batista's chief of police issuing the instruction, "No wounded, no prisoners." In the aftermath, both the PSP and the MR-26-7 took stock in May 1958. The changes in the practice that resulted from these internal debates and the lessons drawn by both organizations led to a convergence in the tactics they advocated for the overthrow of the dictatorship. The PSP accepted the need for armed opposition to the dictatorship, and the MR-26-7 took a more open approach to the working class organization. This paved the way for practical joint activity and a new phase in the revolutionary process that marked another turning point in the history of the Cuban insurrection.
thank you. Thank you for reading the very long quote. Also just if there was some confusion, PSP, I apparently didn't edit the last paragraph, but PSP was the name of the Communist Party at the time. They couldn't call themselves the Communist Party at the time. So they were the Partida Socialista Popular. And then MR-26-7 is the July 26 movement. So next slide. I love this book. I only discovered this book at the beginning of this year, and it's an amazing book. So there were, it's interesting. The Cuban Revolution is an interesting one to think about, right? Because it's one we think of so clearly as a communist revolution. But actually, like the guerrilla forces, the July 26 movement, mostly wasn't communists. Like there were a few people, involved in it that were in the Communist Party, but the guerrilla forces that themselves were like of a mixed class background, of a mixed political background. Many people may know, like Fidel himself came from, petit bourgeois, sort of upper middle class society, and he recruited a lot of people from that society. My quick side note about myself, my grandpa was among them, right? He was among the guerrilla fighters. He switched side and became a counter-revolutionary after that, right? But it's like, he was very much an anti-communist, right? And he was very much from the upper class. And there were a lot of people among the guerrillas who were. There were, of course, also a lot of guerrilla fighters who were workers, and especially, towards the later years of the 10-year period of the revolutionary period, the July 26 movement was really starting to focus on bringing in workers and, building a workers movement within it. But they often sort of were doing revolutionary rebel type activity. They were sabotaging, they were spying. It wasn't sort of traditional trade union organization. So you have the July 26th movement, but then you also have the communist movement, which were very nervous about guerrilla activity. And sometimes you actually see this quite often with communist parties around the world. They're actually sort of more reserved and conservative in a sense, and they don't want to rush into adventurism, right? You don't want to rush into sort of a flash in the pan, starting a guerrilla movement, and then it is all killed, right? And it can ultimately do more harm than good. That's the sort of strategic analysis. So you have this nervousness. So in the beginning, the communists, like as a whole, as a party, were like not involved with guerrillas. There were individual communists that were involved from the beginning, but like it took a while. It took a while for the Communist Party to come around. By the mid 50s, they were starting to, really, because the repression was getting worse. But yeah, even when they were supportive of the movement, they, focused on traditional union organizing, kind of, this model, and in a communist sense. I mean, openly, it's like there were. I heard a fun story once, like an anecdote of workers, sitting around a shop rolling cigars, and then like the leader of the union of the workers there was just like reading Capital. Like that was you're just reading Capital to them while they were working. You know what I mean? So it's just sort of like there was this, traditional like communist union thing that, yeah, at first was kind of, it was a contradiction as opposed to the revolutionary activity. And this book just looks at the ways that those movements came together. And it was because at the grassroots, the workers who were communists or communist sympathetic, and then the workers who were like with the rebels, forced movement to come together and sort of like defied or just sort of quietly do the thing where you're like going to do a thing and ask for forgiveness later, sort of the leadership to work together. And by the end of the decade, really became one. And this is then what leads to the successful victory. And yeah, I just think there's a lot we can learn from this, because again, like I said, like as a communist, and noting that a lot of communist parties, including the US party, are a little more conservative about, sort of a more forcible approach for all kinds of various reasons. Like when do you start mixing it up, right? Like how do you, it's like if you see a movement emerge that isn't part of the Communist Party, but starts to be gaining victories in a sort of militant sense, like how do you do this push pull? How do you reserve these contradictions? How do you stay safe and then also allow for a good channeling of a fight? And it's also just you should definitely read the book. So any of the books that I've pulled readings from this class, almost all of them anyway, like I can find you free copies if you email me or talk to me after class if you want to read the whole things. Because this book, really, I think it's very useful for thinking, through these contradictions of communism and labor, and how do these work together. Is there a question?
Yeah, Anwar says, wow, this reconstruction is great. Thanks for bringing this to attention, how the workers' strikes were crucial in winning the revolution in Cuba. In the reading, I really like the notion that the spontaneous strike that emerged after Pais's death reinforces the organizational development that had preceded the strike, and that it was spontaneous in its emergence due to the long-standing and not spontaneous organization that had enabled such a strike to materialize.
Thank you. Yes. Great, right? And it's like I love the pointing out of like there's this quote unquote spontaneity but even spontaneous movement does not happen spontaneously. Like there's a building up of different dialectical forces that then eventually come out in a sort of wildcat way. That term, for those that don't know, a wildcat strike is one that's not officially sanctioned by the union leadership, and the workers just do it themselves. So yeah, and then this image here on the right was two images, right? So you have the guerrilla force, sort of military holding of a gun, and then the women workers in the factory shop. I just want to point out that women were a very important part of the revolution, and they were doing a lot of the organizing of the underground, including the underground workers networks, and official union organizing that helped, after the Granma crash, for example. So I just wanted to, if you don't know, it's also great history to study. Okay, so now next slide, we're just gonna, I love this table that's in the reading, because it's like, this was the failed general strike. And there's so much stuff that still happened. That's sort of interesting to think about. It's like, it's like you can have all of these sort of strikes and workers movement, and it's still, and that be good and progress in its own way, but then it still be a failure in your goal, right? And I just think that's interesting to think about. So I just like studying this table. You all can look at it in your reading. Great. Okay, next slide. Final slide. Okay, great. So yeah, we've got about 10 minutes more of talking. So what I just want to hear, I've talked so much. I just want to what have you thought about while listening? How do you think you can apply these lessons, today? And yeah.
We have one question from online. Anwar says, another theoretical point, feel free to skip if it's too pedantic. In my understanding, Lenin writes in What is to be Done that independently, workers can organize and only rise to the level of trade unionism and not to revolutionary overthrow of political power. He mentions that a vanguard party is necessary to take the task forward. What is your thinking on this? And then in parentheses, I do not fully agree yet to this thesis, since my understanding is that Marx writes that the working class can only by itself lead to the revolutionary overthrow without necessarily needing a vanguard of the proletariat and revolutionary intelligentsia, who might not even be proletariat in their own origin, even though Lenin shows that even Marx, Engels were bourgeois, to attest to his thesis.
I agree with Lenin, but we're actually going to read What is Not to Be Done next class, so we can get into more of that and debate it. Yeah, but I agree with Lenin. Yeah, that's the short answer. But yeah, what do you, if anyone has thoughts and comments and thinking of like how it's like a lot of you in here are already organizers, so like are there lessons you were drawing? Anyway, anyone? Anyone?
I'll just make a very quick comment that I find this very energizing, because like organizing your workplace is so hard, and like if you just do it for marginally improving your life with like tiny gains on your work benefits or whatever, that's one thing, but be able to project ourselves into like actually improving society together, it's like super inspiring. So very grateful for that.
Yeah.
It was interesting to see that chart of the failed general strike, seeing how many components it had, given the let's say strong prevalence on a lot of online leftist pages or people or groups talking about general strike now, general strike in 1 month, general strike today. What can be learned from, in your opinion, from the failed general strike that perhaps such enthusiasts could incorporate into their own attempt at that struggle?
What do you think?
What do I think? That you can't do it without organizing the people who would be striking. I mean, that's pretty much seems like what the main message here is, right? That it's only spontaneous because all those people were there together thinking about it in the first place. organized in the first place. It wasn't like the idea came up spontaneously. It's like the timing and the circumstances that are the spontaneous part.
Yeah. Oh, can you pass her the mic? Sorry. Just because they can't hear you online.
Oh, okay. I was just saying who the perspective, like who's it spontaneous to? Is it spontaneous to the people who are actually organizing, or is it spontaneous to the people who were watching the fallout?
Right. Did you have a comment?
I also think so much about like the failure of 2020. If we're gonna call that quote unquote spontaneous, going onto the streets, anti-racist protests, and the way I feel like it's personally created a more like cynical mass who believes that that kind of spontaneity of those protests can happen, like a general strike without actual organizing, and that like there was no organization to hold us through 2020. And so I'm just like connecting those dots there. And I think like most people don't understand, like are A, not an organization, and B, don't understand what organizing actually is. I think it's been like the definition of it has like quite been bastardized, in my opinion, since then. And so much of that, I believe, is through like media representation of the way they write about. And then all the workers just walked out of Amazon. But like all the conversations that like happen, like the hard months of labor, like agitation, and yeah, it's people don't actually know the histories. Yeah.
Hope it's on. I think that goes back to like the idea of the unfinished reconstruction of like every revolutionary movement, is that often they're led by people of color, and it's our political power is often white, and so it dehumanizes and diminishes these like organized movements by saying, oh, look at all these poor brown workers who just, Rosa Parks was just tired yesterday and so she didn't get up. And like it happens, we see that narrative happen over and over and over again, and it's just like feeds into this idea that like workers, but also like people of color, don't know what they're doing. And I think coming out of 2020, one of the things that kind of like struck me about it was like I saw a lot more people from not just marginalized backgrounds coming out to protest, but the idea that like, yes, this is going to solve the things, and not being white. I was like, no, it's not going to solve the things, because that's never solved the things. So yeah.
Or it's just one step of many steps to solving the things. Exactly.
I also think that it's sort of to your point. At some of the protests in 2020, there were very clear, consistent, regular, like as much as they screaming as much as they could, instructions from Black protest leadership: don't give the cops an excuse, don't try and instigate them. They will try and make you do something that they can put on camera and then say, look, they started it, do not let it happen. And yet reliably, and as the Intercept later showed, it was partially the feds doing it, and other people showed it was sometimes it was white nationalists doing it, but there were always people not listening. And because no one listened, that meant that it was easy for the cops to then just shut the protest down by claiming that it had turned into violent riots and they were there to protect people. And so if he would listen to the leadership there and taken the leadership more seriously, things could have been very different.
Yeah. Thank you for pointing out. I was going to say, if no one else did, that like part of why there's all these complex reasons that 2020 died down. Part of it was like forcing people back to work. Part of why 2020 was able to happen is because we got a small pittance of, couple $1,000s from the government to like allow us to, and we weren't at work, so we could like be outside. But yeah, it was stopped. It was ended partly because, right, there was no organization that came in to help channel that spontaneous energy, because that's sort of the, the point is not that spontaneity doesn't happen, but that it's not sustained, right? It doesn't sustain itself. You need some sort of structure to keep it going. But then, yeah, also it was stopped. It was destroyed purposefully by the FBI, right? And we need to remember that. Okay, so I was just gonna say last comments. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to, I am thinking about unionizing my workplace right now and just having a hard time thinking about I don't have models, I worked part-time as a union organizer on a card drive campaign for a summer, but I feel like what I learned there was kind of very basic principles, and especially starting out in the very beginning, I feel like kind of what you were saying, there's not a lot of models for how organizing conversation. I'm looking and I'm talking to people and trying to learn, but I feel like how do you strike, also what you were saying, how do you strike the balance between asking the right questions that aren't going to throw people off too much, connecting kind of the importance of us all engaging in collective action together to address the problems in the workplace, which many people talk about all the time, but don't really have an idea of how do we, address them, or don't bring up collective action or working together as a way to address low wages and temporary work and things like that. And then connecting it to kind of broader political issues and building a world where everybody is doing okay and able to survive. And I think that's also because we live in a world where most people aren't organized really in America, as far as I can tell. Yeah. And then the two other things I'm thinking about that I hope we maybe get to talk about in the rest of the class are, one, what is the state of, I feel so there's a lot of different organizations that are not working together. I know the People's Forum brings so much different organizations together, but I don't really know, or I don't know how to tell or analyze what the state of different organizations working together are or not, from just someone who's connected to a few. But yeah, it's kind of hard to tell. And then the other thing is, I feel in thinking about the Black Reconstruction and how you were talking about how there were military forces who were keeping down counter-revolutionary forces through the National Army and the National Guard. And I'm reading State and Revolution, and Lenin talks a lot about that too. But it's we live in the military-industrial complex, capital of the world, where the majority of our budget goes to the army. And I'm just not sure how that would happen. So those are the things I'm thinking about right now.
Great. We're definitely going to get into how to unionize. Third class is going to basically be a sort of workshop for unionizing 101, but also if you or anyone wants to just spitball talking, union after class or outside of class, I would love to do that. It's probably not a good idea to be recording or planning, but but yeah. And yeah, it's a real question, how the hell are we gonna get the the military might on our side? But it is it's not gonna happen tomorrow, but this has been the case in every, the Russian Revolution. The Russian military was one of the most deplorable in the world before 1917. The sort of empire that was being enforced by the troops that then got sick and tired of World War I, created their own little workers' unions, soldiers' workers' unions, and then turned the gun against the generals, right? That's hardly the only example. This is discussed in one of the readings for next class, but the Vietnam War, the American War in Vietnam, of course, the Vietnamese freedom fighters were, the major reason we lost that war. But very important thing that is never talked about were the mass GI strikes and soldier strikes that happened in this country. I mean, a big part of why we stopped fighting in Vietnam is because the soldiers said, no, we're not doing that. They went to jail. They were killed for refusing, but they killed their own generals in the field in Vietnam. And there were there were these huge, massive soldier strikes. And sometimes the, generals themselves would participate too, right? So, and this is erased from history because you don't want to be giving the soldiers ideas, and you don't want people to know that. But I think my opinion of how revolution works is you organize, and then you're ready for the spontaneity, right? And that's how it always is. This is revolutions, throughout history. And then it's like, are you successfully ready enough to have enough of a centralized force to help control that spontaneity? But it's like the Bolsheviks didn't know that 1917 was going to happen, February and then October. They had no idea. The year before, Lenin was like, I don't know, we're going to have this revolution. He was like, we're never going to have it. And then a year later, it happened, right? So, I think we're going to be surprised when it happens, and we'll just be ready to sort of, not surprised, like it'll make sense, but also we're not going to know. So we'll just be ready to sort of, but there's important, veterans organizations and also like there are clandestine networks organizing the military. They just don't talk about it because that's real illegal. But thank you. That's an excellent question. It's a great question to end on. And I'm sorry, because it is 8:30, so I just don't want to keep anyone, but if you want to ask me after, please. And then, we're just going to close on a song from the Cuban Revolution.
Really quick before we close, I want to share.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
It's okay. No. Also, thank you, Justine. Thank you, everyone, for coming out today for the first day of our course. Really excited to see the next few weeks. And before we close and play the song, I want to share Dan's comment. Dan said, I think it's a beautiful one. Revolution is possible. A new world is possible. So felt very optimistic to share that with you all.
Thank you.
Aquí pensaban seguir ganando el 100% con casas de apartamentos y echar al pueblo a sufrir y seguir de modo cruel contra el pueblo conspirando para seguirlo explotando, y en eso llegó Fidel. Y se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Aquí pensaban seguir, tragando y tragando tierra, sin sospechar que en la sierra se alumbraba el porvenir. Y seguir de modo cruel la costumbre del delito, hacer de Cuba un garito, y en eso llegó Fidel. Y se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Y se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Aquí pensaban seguir, diciendo que los cuatreros, forajidos, bandoleros, asolaban al país, y seguir de modo cruel, con la infamia por escudo, difamando a los barbudos, y en eso llegó Fidel. Y se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Y se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Aquí pensaban seguir jugando a la democracia, y el pueblo que en su desgracia se acabara de morir. y seguir de modo cruel, sin cuidarse ni la forma, con el robo como norma, y en eso llegó Fidel. Y se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar. Y se acabó la diversión, llegó el comandante y mandó a parar.